All right, this is part 11 of the Gerald Shea Memorandum. And this is one of the final parts to the memorandum. It's regarding the CI's roles and responsibilities. So let's get right to it. Finally, it is possible that the CIA was aware that the two Israeli groups were tracking suspected Arab groups on our soil, but remained unaware until after September 11th that they had come across the future hijackers. In previous videos, I talked about this, that the CIA may have very well known about the Israeli groups, and they would have invited the help, thinking that they would act in good faith in giving them all the information. Now realizing that the Israelis might have very well withheld the information in allowing the 9/11 attacks to happen. These are scenarios that are pretty much, these are speculative, and but they're reasonable, because you have to think on the bigger picture here. Would the CIA have been the only agency to know? Of course not. Now we know that's not true. We know the Saudis knew, we knew the Israelis knew, but how much did they know? And how much did they not know? Like I said before, we don't know the specifics. We know the general information. We know that the foreign and domestic agencies were monitoring the 9/11 hijackers. But how did they first come, or how did they first hear about these people? That's the question. What benefit would it bring the Israelis to withhold this information? Obviously, it would be the United States going to war against Afghanistan and Iraq. Why? Because we have dual Israeli citizens in the Bush White House. No more than any other administration. The most neocon White House we've ever had. And 9/11 certainly did benefit the Israelis and the neocons in the White House, because we went to war with the Middle East, not with the countries who had these participants come from. It's not anti-Semitic to say so either. If you're interested in justice, interested in right and wrong, and to hold people accountable for crimes, such as withholding information that could prevent 9/11, well, then we've got to stop pointing to the fingers of the people who possess this information. Was it Qatar? Was it China? Was it Russia? Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States. That's who. There is presently little evidence of the CIA's possible knowledge of the Israeli group's activities beyond the sheer scope and magnitude of the Israeli DEA group's operations in the U.S. The CIA's general unwillingness to share information with the FBI, as outlined in the Commission's final report, and perhaps brazenness of the Israeli New Jersey group on September 11th. The CIA's clumsy reconstruction of the miraculous work of John, Mary, Jane, and Alice, which appears designed to point away from the Israeli warnings, also raises legitimate questions. Could it be that the CIA was working with the Israelis, or could it have been the Israelis were working tentatively with the CIA and didn't share all the information? I think that's the more plausible answer here. Because who would know about the specifics of the operation? People with signals intelligence, people listening to phone calls. And who was doing that? The NSA and the Israelis through this arch student ring. Not the one in the World Trade Center. That's the false one. That's where disinformation people like Rebecca Roth want you to look away from here. They're not even Israeli in the World Trade Center. They're Austrian art students. And do you really think that they're going to allow pictures to be taken of them wiring the building? Rebecca Roth wants you to think, she thinks you're stupid. That's what she thinks. You're dumb enough to believe that. The CIA was prohibited by law from engaging in field intelligence operations inside the United States. They may have been reluctant to cooperate with the FBI because of the burdensome constraints of constitutional protections benefiting potential defendants. That came out in the Cannistrail file. That's the reason why they withheld information from the FBI, because the CIA was running an illegal operation inside the United States with the Saudis. That's why they never shared that information about Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hadmi having dual U.S. visas in San Diego while living inside the United States. It's not the CIA's jurisdiction. It's the Department of Justice. That's the reason why the CIA didn't work with the FBI regarding this, because the FBI was investigating the USS Cole bombing at that point, and it's reported that both Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hadmi met with the planner of the Cole bombing, Tawfiq bin Attash, at a Malaysia summit meeting in January 2000, for which the CIA and the NSA were monitoring. They also regard the Israelis as unusually effective because of their familiarity with Arab culture and their common understanding of the Arabic language. That's right, because with groups like the Mr. of Rim, which is a very covert Israeli group in Israel that actually has Israeli agents and assets, live amongst the Palestinian people and think that these people are Palestinians, that they'll learn about groups like the inner workings of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas. The leading Israeli newspaper, Yadoth Arnuth, reported in the fall of 2002 that prior to September 11 attacks, when members of the Israeli DA groups were being detained or arrested across the United States, the CIA actively promoted their expulsion. Why? That's news to me. This is the first time I'm hearing it. The implication in that article was that the CIA was simply being careless, not trying to spirit the Israeli safety out of the country. But at this point, we cannot be certain. The CIA may have been eager to protect the surveillance activities of the Israeli groups as a whole in an operation that ultimately failed to protect us. Because if the CIA was working tentatively with Israel, this would mean that less people talking to domestic investigators about the CIA working in illegal operations inside the United States, not just with the Saudis, but the Israelis as well. And if the Israelis had information about 9/11 and the CIA knew that they withheld it, but they were sharing some information with the CIA certainly don't want the White House to find out. That means someone's going to be held accountable. That means Director Tenet won't get his presidential medal, in which he did. Presidential Medal of Freedom from the director of the CIA. I think that was in 2003 or 4, after the commission hearings, in which Director Tenet lied, committed perjury. Only if you could get rewarded for lying. By withholding information which could have stopped the crime. That's what these people think of you. Any delegation on part of the CIA of its responsibilities abroad to foreign agents in the U.S. would, of course, have been unlawful. Right. Would have also rendered our country particularly vulnerable because, as suggested above, the interests of the Israeli government and its agents are not necessarily consistent with our own. Bang. There it is. Right? Because the foreign policy of Israel is a detriment to hegemony in the Middle East, something that the American people desperately want. But the government of the United States, because they're bought and sold for by many foreign government dignitaries, one being Israel, a main player in our foreign policy, basically still to this day dictate our foreign policy. Now, if we were to leave the Middle East, that would leave Israel renderless, defenseless, because they don't have a good military at all. We provide most of the weapons. We provide most of the training. Same for Saudi Arabia. It would be a total war in the Middle East if the U.S. were to leave. Even though with the U.S. in the Middle East, we're still at total war. So that means we need cooler heads to prevail, which I don't see in the future. The CIA also failed to press for the continuing detention of the members of the Israeli New Jersey group after their arrest on September 11th. After 3 months, the men were released and returned to Israel, even though their names had appeared in our own counterintelligence database. At least 2 of them were suspected Mossad agents, and their leader had fled to Israel on or about September 14th, only to be placed on the May 2002 FBI suspect list a few months later. Dominic Suter, the owner of Urban Moving Systems, was on the FBI's top 10 watch list with Osama bin Laden. How about that one? Excuse me. The CIA is mentioned, but once in the DEA report, in connection with the Israeli DEA group's efforts to penetrate the DEA's Southwest Laboratory near San Diego, where Midar and Hazmi were living. What role the CIA then played does not appear. It is clear that the DEA report was itself inspired by the DEA's own bewilderment by the very existence of the Israeli DEA groups. Because the DEA probably said, well, what the hell are they following us for? What information do we have? By the scope of their operation throughout much of the country, by their overwhelming numbers, and by their expertise. The forward article cited above states that the operations of the Israeli groups heightened tensions between Washington and Israel, quote, not because of the operations, our targets, but because of Israel reportedly violating a secret gentleman's agreement between the 2 countries under which espionage on the other soil to be coordinated in advance, end quote. Hey, tell us before you do it. How about that? So this way we can hide the real sensitive information, but you can take the other. I guess this is what allies do for each other. They spy on one another to find out what weaknesses we have so they could exploit them. This is what the Israeli government is doing. The real question today, however, appears to be whether the gentleman's agreement did indeed prevail here, and because we lacked adequate warning from our surrogates who were keeping the Arabs under surveillance, helped bring us to disaster. Because if Israel really did find out about the planes operation and didn't share that information, that would be the end of Israel having been an ally. And then what? The Samson option, where Israel commits self-suicide and kills the whole world too? Because if they can't have a country, we can't have a world, which is what the Samson option book relates to. The tragedy of the DA report becomes evident only after sifting through all the twists and turns of its raw data, often dull, sometimes disquieting, and reading for one last time the struggle of its authors to find a rational explanation in the introductory paragraphs. Today, in retrospect, the DA report written in June of 2001 seems in effect a cry for help. The public inquiry into these events must include an examination into whether the CIA may have been aware of or promoted or condoned the surveillance by the Israeli groups or suspect Arab groups in the U.S. That's the end of the chapter. And that really gets to the heart of the matter, right? Was the CIA working tentatively with the Saudis, tentatively with the Israelis, who were monitoring intimately members of Al-Qaeda and members of the planes operation? When I say intimately, I mean coordinating with, commiserating with them, which is what the Saudis were doing with Omar al-Bayoumi, Fahad al-Damari, Anwar al-Awlaki, Osama Basnan, and others, Mossad al-Jarrah, coordinated with Khalid al-Midar and Nawaf al-Hazmi in California. Then you have the Israeli groups using moving front companies and the art student ring to follow where these people were going. We're talking about Al Qaeda and members of the Hamburg cell in Florida, in Virginia, in New York, in New Jersey, in San Diego, in Arizona, in Texas, and their associates. So that means the Israelis and Saudis, if, and this is a huge if, we got to be careful here, had intimate knowledge of 9/11, had intimate knowledge of the plane's operation, would it benefit them for having the United States known about it and stop it? That's the question we must ask. We must ask ourselves: who are the enemies of Saudi Arabia? Who are the enemies of Israel? What are their foreign policy guidelines? This is the reason why, when you study 9/11, you have to study the foreign policies of these governments and the intelligence agencies and how they work. This is the reason why I have these playlists on my YouTube channel, so you can have a general understanding of how they operate, because it all connects. And this Gerald Shea memo is proof of that connection. But then again, we must also entertain that the Israelis and Saudis didn't know the specifics, because we don't know what they have or what they don't have. And they're not willing to share that information. Why would they? Because it all comes down to knowledge. You could believe whatever you want, but do you know it? Because we can act on knowledge. We can act on information. We can't act on belief. All right. We have, I think, one more chapter left in this report, and I'll do that soon enough. Have a good day, everybody. See you next video.